Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm here with my good friend and our producer, Chris, who is joining me in the co-host chair this week. Chris, welcome to the podcast intro.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I feel great. It's a little weird being on this side of the microphone. But as you can see, I've adorned my microphone with some holiday decorations, to be festive.
Yes, it looks like you have a felt Christmas tree hanging from your microphone.
I do. It's probably about 40 years old.
Nice.
I can't remember which family member made it, but, it's weird.
Wish I had thought of it. And it's funny having you here, for the first time, because the truth is you're probably about 1,000 times more qualified to be doing this than I am.
Well, producers are notorious for wanting to be on the other side of the mic because they're always sitting in judgment.
Now's your shot. You can knock Bill off his seat.
Look out.
I'm really psyched for this week's episode. I sat in on the recording for this one, and it was such a fascinating conversation that I can't wait to share. And so this week's host is actually Phil Garnham from our Monotype studio.
Yeah, I know Phil.
Phil's hosted a few episodes in the past. But our guest is a man named Elliot Jay Stocks. Elliot is sort of a creative of all trades. He calls himself a designer on his website, just as an all-encompassing term, but he is deep in the world of typography and design and is a musician as well. In a previous life, Elliot was creative director at Adobe Fonts, and he is currently working on the Google Fonts Knowledge Center, which is just a resource within the Google Fonts landscape where you can go and learn about type and how to use type and get some of your typographic questions answered.
Yeah. And Carl, Google does these things where they have these labs and stuff. And I just feel very much like a moth to a flame as an outsider. I love their little music studio. You can go and just tinker around there and that's always fun. But with fonts, before working on this podcast, I knew very little about typefaces, and I also used to call them fonts all the time and didn't know the difference. So now I feel like I am now educated.
Yep.
And I just didn't realize how many fonts there are out there. It's a little overwhelming.
Yeah. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of typefaces out there in the world. And even within this podcast, you've kind of seen the full range of what's available. We've talked to Trey Seals from Vocal Type, James Edmondson from Oh No, quote unquote boutique foundries, small independent foundries doing amazing work. You've got a company like ours, Monotype, which is home to something like 40,000 fonts. And now here comes Elliot, who's worked at Adobe Fonts and now Google, and Google has a huge library of open source fonts of its own. So there's just a ton out there, and people like Elliot are essential because if you're a designer, whether you're experienced or new or professional or casual, that amount of choice can be paralyzing. So how do you choose? How do you know what you're looking at? How do you know what to do with it? How do you know how to pair? And we at Monotype try to provide that kind of information to people as well. But someone like Elliot, that's what he's doing. He's helping people use type better, regardless of where they get it. So thank goodness for people like Elliot.
Well, Carl, with that, let's turn it over to Phil and Elliot for what sounds like a really fascinating conversation. And we hope you enjoy.
So, hello. Thanks so much for popping over to this Monotype podcast. It's been a while since I've been in the presenting chair, so I'm thrilled to be here with a longtime friend of Fontsmith and Monotype, Elliot Jay Stocks. Elliot probably needs no introduction, so I'll briefly say that he's a musician, a designer, a type enthusiast who's really just been pushing that enthusiasm into the typosphere to create the Google Fonts knowledge platform. So Elliot, I'm sure you can do a much better introduction to yourself, so take it away.
Oh, thank you, Phil. Really nice to be here. So thank you for the invitation and the very kind words. The typosphere, I like that. I like that. I should be using the typosphere a bit more often, I think. That's not an official monotype term, right? We can co-opt that.
It's Essex-based typo language.
I love it. Excellent. Yeah, I was trying to think when we first chatted, which was when I was doing 8 Faces, and I interviewed you and Jason, and I think we're talking about 11 years or so now, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. And that little magazine was kind of my sort of semi-introduction to the typosphere, I suppose. I'd started getting enthusiastic about type. I was a web designer at the time. I wanted to make a print project. I was learning about typography. Web fonts were becoming a thing. And then doing this magazine kind of just threw me into that world. And I learned a lot whilst doing it about print and obviously the subject matter itself. And then from there, it's just kind of been just full on into lots of type specific roles. And yeah, it's been loads of fun. I spent some time at Adobe Typekit, obviously now known as Adobe Fonts. And that was, I found out later, was kind of on the back of my work for 8 Faces magazine. So that was really nice. And as you say, recently I've been helping bring about Google Fonts knowledge. We actually launched at the end of last year, and so we're just coming up to the 1-year anniversary. We've been putting out a load of new content every quarter. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. We've just released our new one, at the time of recording. We put it out last week, and yeah, I'm super proud of the resource. It's been great to just work with so many talented type enthusiasts to kind of just spread the word and kind of bring that out to the wider public.
It's amazing. I love that. I mean, I've always been a big advocate of personal projects, side projects, and I just love the fact that your whole career has really been built around that idea of planting little seeds everywhere and then eventually blossoming at various points in life. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. Oh, cheers. Thank you. It's very accidental. There's there was never been a strategy there.
Yeah, there may not be a strategy, but I think you make your own luck as well in this creative world. I think, you just... Yeah, I know, you're probably quite like me. I can see you've got your music in the background, your keyboards. Yeah, the same with me, my guitars on the wall. Just creative people just love to create and make things and put things out there, and just stuff happens. And I kind of see your career like that, actually.
Awesome, that's nice to hear, because I guess it is like that. Like I said, no strategy, but certainly I'm a big fan of just doing whatever kind of moves you at that particular time. If it's a music thing or it's a type thing or any kind of side project. I'm a big fan of side projects and have definitely put out a fair few things. Some of them really small, some of them big, like magazines and stuff like that. But definitely it's helped to kind of, as you say, it's a small seed that's planted, and then in the future that leads to something, especially when so many of these things involve talking to different people. And obviously the whole thing of, it's not what you know, it's who you know, and all of those people that you meet. And well, actually, this is a great example of us meeting sort of through my love of Fontsmith and wanting to interview you and Jason for the magazine years ago. And here we are. But lots of little connections like that where things have certainly led to other projects down the line. And actually, that's a big... I'm doing a talk on this in a couple of months, actually, specifically about connecting those dots from the side projects, the kind of the passion projects, and how they do eventually lead to paid work and consultancy and other opportunities. I think it can be hard at the time to necessarily see those lines. You just put stuff out there and these things happen organically. But with hindsight, it's nice to be able to look back and say, oh yeah, that came about because of this relationship with this person or this product that I put out there or this connection that was made. It's very satisfying.
Well, it's such a small world as well, creativity and design and just the industry. Like even last week we had our Brand Talks event in London, and I was just bumping into like project managers from other agencies that had commissioned custom fonts that were now working at a different agency. And these are project managers, not designers, but they're still really interested in what we do and typefaces, even on a creative level. And they're like, oh no, I have to get you into this agency or that agency, and just... Yeah, it's like this weird bubble that we live in, and it all connects together somehow.
Yeah, I love it. And I think the type world as well is like a particularly, it's not a small bubble. And I guess if anything, it's much bigger than even when I started getting into it, sort of 15 years ago. But still, it feels like, everyone's in it together. I love it. I love that sense of it being kind of a small little crowd.
Yeah. So what are you working on right now? What's kind of your day looking like today?
Today, well, as I said, we just launched the latest kind of content drop for Google Fonts Knowledge last week. So things are now a little bit quieter, which is great. Just kind of winding down for the Christmas holidays. And I'm doing some planning for next year. So things are going to take a little bit of a different shape next year. So just working out what that's going to look like. So it's really nice actually to have a bit of headspace to do some of that planning, because it's been pretty hectic up to now. So it's great to have a bit of a pre-Christmas wind down.
Oh, pre-Christmas wind down. I've not had that for years. It feels like everybody says, oh, we've got budget to spend, or let's do that font that we've always wanted to do. Oh, right, great. Can we have it in 2 weeks? Okay.
Yeah. How hard can it be, right?
yeah. It's only a typeface, right? It's just such an easy thing to do. But yeah, it's all good. Yeah. I think something that really interests me is the music that you're heavily involved with. You began your career at EMI.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I think I can relate to that a little bit, in that I think music is such an important aspect of design and studio culture. You know, the arguments you have about what you're going to put on the Sonos in the studio and all of that, politics. I mean, how big is music to you as a creative person?
It's huge. I mean, I've really got into it in the last few years. So I've always kind of been involved in music, and it's definitely been intertwined with design, just in terms of sort of my first kind of output as a designer was totally music based. So after I left high school, before I went to uni, I took a year out, and at the time I was working as a sales assistant in Virgin Megastore when that shop still existed. Yeah, the good old days. And a few of us who worked on the shop floor were musicians and sort of dabbling with some what now is very embarrassing music to look back on. Yeah. But, you know, we were doing it, and it's great, you know, you're 18 and you're into it. And we decided to put out a CD, and our managers at the store they said, oh, you know, if you put something out, you can put it on the shop floor and put it into their whole, you know, point of sale system and all this kind of thing. And, brilliant. You know, at the time it was a dream come true. So this is like, you know, pre-streaming, pre-digital music, really. And so a few of us got together and we did that, and we it wasn't really a label officially, but we got together the CD, we got CD manufactured, and I was responsible for the artwork, and I'd been sort of starting to experiment with some sort of baby version of Photoshop at the time. Some, you know, dodgy grunge fonts. And, I've been there. You know, we've all done it. And they wanted to have, as well as the cover, there was the point of sale actual stand that they gave us in the store as well. So there was that to design, plus the website. And so there was a program at the time called Homestead, which was like this very early WYSIWYG site design tool, you know, spat out terrible code and stuff, but you could, you know, just drag and drop boxes around. And I did that and I loved it. And that was my sort of gateway into web design, which is sort of where I spent the first big chunk of my career, was being a web designer. And doing that release for our music that we put out then paved the way for doing similar stuff while I was at university. And I got involved doing a bunch of flash sites for friends' bands, basically. And then, when I left uni, although I did have my university work to show, most of my portfolio was full of these extracurricular activities, I suppose, like all these kind of flash sites for friends' bands and stuff. And so I had this very sort of music specific portfolio. And so my sort of first real job that I got out of uni was as a junior web designer for EMI, when EMI still existed. They also don't anymore. But that was amazing, you know, at the time. You know, I was you know, in my early 20s, absolute dream job to be working with all these amazing household name artists and bands.
Yeah. This is really funny. I'm just suddenly seeing all these parallels between our lives. I was in a mod revival kind of band, the Small Faces, the Jam, all of that, and we were putting out music as well. Cool. And designing. You know, I was the only designer in the band, so I was doing that as well. The grunge fonts definitely resonates on that around that period. But it's a brilliant time. So was there some moment or a point in time where you suddenly thought, typography is something that really, really interests me?
Yeah, there was. It was about 2009-ish that web fonts were becoming more of a thing. And it felt like web design in general had kind of grown up a little bit by then. So as I mentioned, I was doing a lot of Flash stuff, and then fast forward a bit through to sort of web standards and getting involved in HTML, CSS, that kind of thing. And then I moved to another record label and I was doing some stuff for them. And this was Sanctuary Records, and they were very, very quiet. They were kind of in the process of going under, which was fantastic because we just had loads of time on our hands just to sort of do whatever. And I just used it to learn HTML, CSS better than I had before, and to kind of get involved in that and do a lot of writing around it for some magazines. And I started doing some speaking around that time. And web design was just kind of changing so rapidly then, I think. And do you remember there was like so say you wanted to have like, some font that wasn't a system font used in your nav, for instance, and we would kind of put it in an image and you would kind of move that sprite around. And so I was just like doing all that kind of stuff, totally inaccessible, really terrible stuff. But then when web fonts started to become a bit more of a thing just after that, and we could kind of get beyond all of those kind of practices, this was when everything kind of got really exciting. And I think that coincided with web design growing up, browser support getting really, really good for web fonts. This was the really early days of Typekit as well. Obviously, this is pre-Google Fonts, a little bit before Font Deck as well, although I think those guys were kind of starting to do some of their sort of initial research. And I spoke at South by Southwest on a panel with John Tan and Samantha Warren and Ian Coyle. And Ian said something on that panel about how you only need 8 faces to work with, just those tried and true workhorses. And that idea really resonated with me. And that moment was the other kind of thing that coincided for me personally, was that I had kind of got a little bit frustrated with my work as a web designer just disappearing and just, off into the ether. And I wanted something a little bit more permanent. And I hadn't really done much print design beyond the odd poster or CD cover and this kind of thing. And I wanted to do something a bit more involved. And so I came up with this idea for this typography magazine that would allow me to do that and allow me to learn about this thing that I was really only just about getting into properly. And that came about, and it was one of those ideas you're like, this is just an idea. No one's going to say yes to this. And it turned out that everyone I asked to be interviewed in that first issue said yes. And I thought, oh, wow, I actually have to kind of make this thing now. And then I made it also kind of thinking that it was just something that I would personally like to have on my shelf. And that's all it needed to satisfy. But it did really well. I think we did 1,000 copies of the first issue and it sold out in a couple of hours. And it was just a huge buzz, the idea of just putting something out there into the world. And especially, again, as a web designer at the time, so used to not putting out anything physical, it was just immensely satisfying. And that was the moment where everything just kind of went headlong into not only the kind of type world, but also moving away from web design and me doing more sort of print work and branding and that sort of holistic side of design.
Yeah, it's funny because I was going to say, like, did it almost come about as a reaction to maybe your reputation? Was it you didn't want to be positioned maybe as a designer as being only a web designer? You wanted to look more versatile than that. Did you wanted to add another string to your bow, I guess?
I think looking back now, I don't know if it was necessarily that conscious a thought at the time, but I guess certainly I had become not disenchanted with web design, but just that sense of I wanted it to do something that had a bit more permanence to it. I was very fortunate as well because I got involved with some web projects that also wanted some sort of branding element. So for instance, for the very first Brooklyn Beta conference, I did their website, but also their branding as well. So, and that was really fun because we got to work with Mark Caniso of PS Type. He did... Let me think about this. He had a typeface out. It was a Sans called Quattro, and he was working on the slab version of that, but it was not finished. He had like posted a couple of teaser images online or something like that. And I loved it. And I was like, got in touch and said, if you've got sort of a beta version of this font that we could then kind of like try out as the type for the logo. And he said yes. And so the Brooklyn Beta logo was actually made with beta fonts for this typeface. And it was great. I loved that, not only the kind of very, very sort of meta level of working in that way, but that wonderful sort of closed feedback loop of working with a designer while something's still in progress. And that started my love of just reaching out to type designers and talking to them and working with them directly. And that's the thing I always encourage people to do as well, because I think so many folks don't realize that actually, you know, a lot of type designers are kind of one-person shows, and they are totally up for some bespoke work and some collaborations if it's interesting, and always encourage people to do that.
I think that you touched on a really interesting point there about the temporality, I guess, of web design, and there's almost like this legacy idea, isn't there? As designers, you don't want to feel you're going to be forgotten. You want to feel like you've made your mark on the world. And yeah, I definitely felt that way when I became a type designer. I wanted to design like one of the classics. I wanted to like put something out that was going to be one of those fonts that was going to be around for the next 200 years and people would be still using it, Caslon or whatever. And Phil Garnham did that. He's dead. He's buried now, but his font's still out there. It's still around. I don't know. There's something about that, I think, in design.
Yeah, definitely. I guess maybe the earlier stuff that you were putting out as Fontsmith as well was so like rooted to London as well, you know, like it felt, everything almost felt like, you know, Clerkenwell, and it was almost a street name, you know, everything kind of felt very kind of grounded in reality in that way. I really like the way that you guys did that.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed like just designing type in terms of like personality, you know, like, oh my, I've got this really quirky auntie, so I'm going to design like a font that represents her quirks, or like naming a font after our kids and that kind of thing. I love that.
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. I think you even had an FS Elliot, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. Hey. We didn't design that one actually. It's a third party typeface, but yeah, it's a great typeface actually, I have to say. So, I mean, do you ever see Eight Faces returning as a magazine? There's so much first, like you said, for type knowledge. People just can't get enough of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to bring it back in some form. So it's a weird one because the magazine existed for 8 issues, which was always the plan from the beginning. I always wanted it to just be 8. And so finished it after 8, and then a couple of years went by and I did that typical designer thing of becoming dissatisfied with like how it used to be, and maybe this is like a symptom of me being a web designer and being used to changing things all the time and going, oh, it's harder to do that with print. But I really wanted to redo some stuff. I was really dissatisfied with a lot of the early design in the early issues. You know, I had no idea what I was doing. As I said, I was very new to it at that time. So the very first issue of Eight Faces, I designed the favorite spreads. So the spreads that we had where each designer would pick their 8 favorite typefaces. And I did a really terrible job of it. And I commissioned John Tan to do them to begin with. And then a designer in Cologne called Stefan Weyer took over and he did the rest of the issues. And so we had all these issues that had these spreads by John and then Stefan. And I wanted to go back to that first one that was done by me and I really hated, and get Stefan to redo that. So that was the impetus for that. But I also looked back and wanted to re-edit the interviews as well, as a lot of time had passed for some people to kind of catch up and see what happened in the space of time between the interview and then. And also to bring in some new stuff. So Jamie Clark, who's a friend of mine and now neighbor, he now lives in the same village as me, just up the road. He was running this blog called Type Worship, this Tumblr blog, and we decided to collaborate and turn it into the Eight Faces blog. And so for quite a few years, he'd started to accumulate these really great blog articles as well. And I thought, well, it'd be really nice to put some of that into the book. I wanted to collect all of these issues of the magazine into one book and all this extra stuff around it, re-edit it, redesign it, all this kind of thing, and just kind of make it into this new package, the kind of definitive edition, I suppose. So I ran this Kickstarter campaign to do that, and we made this book, Eight Faces Collected, which was successfully funded, and, you know, really, really proud of that really big hardback book. Not without its challenges. It was misbound in its first run. And yeah, there were some pages put in the wrong order. And it was a semi-disaster. Well, I mean, my heart stopped when I saw it because we were about to send out, you know, all 1,000 copies out to everybody. Fortunately, the printer did manage to completely redo it. Thank goodness for that. But that got put out there. The Eight Faces blog continued. And so Eight Faces has still kind of had a life outside of the magazine ending. And I did do a little Twitter poll, I don't know when it was, maybe a year ago, saying, you know, I'm toying with the idea of Eight Faces coming back. You know, would anyone be interested? And the results were mixed, but generally the highest answer on that poll was sadly, now I've had my fill. So I was like, oh, that's a bit of a shame. Although maybe that saved me some money.
Yeah.
But it's hard doing stuff in print. And when you say that a magazine's coming back, then it's a commitment of, or you can't just do one more issue. You've got to do, you got to make it a substantial thing. I mean, you guys also had a fantastic Type magazine as well, right?
Yeah, Type Notes.
Type Notes, yes.
Yeah. It's really good fun. We love putting that together, and it almost it just made so much sense. We were writing so much content in the studio for other blogs, other platforms. Why don't we make it proper? Why don't we put it in print? Why don't we share that in a more permanent form? But again, the same is just such hard work. Building, printing, editing, just proofing. It just never ends, does it? When it comes to doing anything physical. So the digital world has definitely sped things up in that sense.
Definitely, yeah. And after Eight Faces finished, I still kind of had this desire to do a magazine and to do something that reached a bit of a wider audience. And so my wife, who's a writer and editor, she wanted to do something together. So it was great. We sort of finally got to work on a project together, which we wanted to do for a long time. And we made a lifestyle magazine called Largon, which ran for 10 issues. And so that kind of, just after Eight Faces finished, that started. And we did that, for about 5 years. And really, really proud of that. And that definitely kind of helped scratch that magazine itch. But because that went to a wider audience, I was totally naive. I was like, Eight Faces got advertising really easily, got partnerships really easily. It's all good. I'll just bring all those folks over to our new magazine. And it worked for the first issue or two, but it really didn't last. And a lot of those advertisers, they didn't want to stay on board for the whole run, which is totally fair enough. And a lot of the kind of more lifestyle brands that we were trying to get involved to help finance it they just never really had the money. And doing all of that work to kind of try and drum up partnership and get people to sponsor things. And that's a full-time job, and I'm just not a salesperson at all. And so I just kind of ended up sort of hating that side of things, which was a bit of a shame, because it's almost like a bit of a necessary evil when you're doing a physical product that needs financing in some way. So, but that's, never say never. I think there's the potential to do something again in some form. And I do still love having something physical, to put on the shelf.
I think Largon really appeals to me a lot, because I'm basically training to be a yoga teacher as well. I'm really into the wellness vibe.
Cool.
Yeah, I've got my head in a lot of books written in the dark caves of the Himalayas, learning lots of very interesting rituals and things. But I'm really interested in that. I've heard you speak about work-life balance before in the past, and I'm wondering, did you kind of discover anything from that time in terms of a wellness kind of package? Did you figure something out? Do you work in a certain way to get that work-life balance and family life balance and everything else? So much, you've got kids as well, right? Yeah,
two kids. And
same here.
I don't know if I necessarily found the answer as it were from there. Definitely it was eye-opening for sure, seeing how other people tackled that. I suppose the common theme that ran through those interviews as people that we met doing that magazine, and I think runs through our own approach to work and life, is that it's always malleable. There's never, I don't think, this is how we do work-life balance and that is it. It's always a bit of a moving target. And I think accepting that has probably brought about some sense of calm. That I think also the nature of being, both of us sort of work independently, obviously have sort of long form contracts and stuff like that, but generally, sort of still sort of freelance life for want of a better word. And that always means things are always going to be a little bit up in the air. There's always the unknown sort of coming at some point. And with the demands of family life as well, it can be hard to juggle that. But one thing that's always been the thread that's run through those interviews that we did and sort of my own work has been to follow what you're passionate about, to let those passions guide you. And that's not to say, don't worry about paying the bills or your mortgage, because you just do what you love. That's not helpful. But to always allow time for the things that you really care about, even if that's actually a small amount of time, but just to always make sure there is that time for that. So mentally you can feel balanced in that sense. And also, sort of from a productivity point of view, to feel that you are still putting out that kind of stuff. I mean, for me personally, where my head is at the moment for that is with music. I have very, very little time to work on music these days. But if I just get an hour and I say, right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to head back out to the studio at night. I'm going to give myself that time. and then just use that time to really make the most of it. And actually, even if it's not necessarily productive, like the foundations of a track or something don't come out of it, just being out there and being in that different mode, that different kind of creative mode, just helps with that sense of balancing the demands of being a responsible adult with also someone who just wants to create something and put something out there in whatever form.
Yeah, I think you touched on it actually a little bit there with that idea of accepting the here and now. This is where you're at, but you're not going to be here at all times, and just keep being positive. And I think, like, actually even my own career, I feel like there's a degree of kind of being uncomfortable that I kind of need in my life. And in a way, through wellness and kind of meditation, all these things, yoga, you're trying to move past that. Actually, I think it's quite healthy to be uncomfortable, because it means you're not complacent. It means you're constantly learning and wanting to achieve something new.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the curse of being a creative, that you're always going to feel that need to be pushing out to something else, to always be sort of striving to create the next thing.
Absolutely. I'm a serial hobbyist. I have projects in the garden. I started a Twitter account doing graphic novel kind of illustration. I've got the music. It's never ending. I'm just always like thinking, okay, well, I'm not doing enough of this, so I better try some of that. And it's just silly.
Totally there with you. And I'm glad you brought up meditation, because I've been meditating for only about the last year or so, but I've personally found that to be very, very beneficial to my sort of mental well-being, just in terms of especially just realizing how noisy your own head is, just that sense of trying to make space, trying to make 10 minutes to sit and to be present. And it's very hard, to actually quiet your mind. And I use the Calm app, which I really love. The guided meditation there has been super helpful. Yeah. Oh, nice. Just in general, I think the mental health benefits of just taking some time away from everything, just meditating and just being present is huge. For me personally, it's been a big thing.
Awesome. I guess your work in both sort of magazines, Typekit was really a gateway into life at Adobe. I'm curious about how your role really evolved at Adobe, because I feel like I'm in a slightly similar situation, having been acquired as Fontsmith and being a small company, then suddenly being in a big company. How did you kind of handle that, and how did your role kind of change as you worked at Adobe?
Yeah, so I joined just after the acquisition. So they'd been acquired by Adobe and had just moved into the Adobe building in San Francisco. So to begin with, it was very, very hands-on. And for a long time, Typekit enjoyed quite a healthy degree of being, I suppose, sort of siloed away from the rest of the Adobe mothership. So we kind of got to just sort of do our own thing in the corner of the office for a long time. And I remember at the time, Zeldman said something like, it's not like Adobe have acquired Typekit, but Typekit's acquired Adobe, because it was such a huge thing to kind of take that on board. But for a long time, we were kind of quite independent in that sense. I was designing a lot of the interface for what at the time Typekit was just kind of the website. It was all around web fonts. And we were talking to some other partners about some integrations, and we were doing a lot of work there. But gradually over the time, I was there for just shy of 3 years. And as you can imagine, we gradually became sort of more Adobe-fied. So I sort of ended up being less hands-on, more managerial, more sort of overseeing things. And it became less about Typekit, the service, and more about how Typekit integrates into Adobe's wider sort of ecosystem. So I kind of oversaw a lot of that. And then I left when it was still called Adobe Typekit, but obviously did then eventually become Adobe Font. So I did shed a little bit of a tear when we eventually lost that Typekit brand, which was sad. But I had such a great time there, and a lot of the work that I did there was actually not necessarily just on the product, but I would do all of the kind of printed material for if we were sponsoring a conference, and some t-shirt design and little book design and some design around some of the Adobe Originals typefaces that were being released. But that was the really fun stuff. And when I look back, it was a great time. It was a really wonderful team. And at that particular point in its history, just post-acquisition, I said we got to enjoy a lot of independence, but with the support of a very large organization.
That's great. How do you feel about the Adobe Type brand? Do you feel like it's changed much since you left? Is it going in a way that maybe you would have liked, or? not?
I mean, like I said, I kind of shed a tear when it became Adobe Fonts because it did feel like the end of an era, and sort of visually, I think things had changed in such a way to be quite far removed from the Typekit of yore. Even though, you know, what's there now is some stuff that I sort of set in motion from my time there. Some of the designs I did shortly before I left. But yeah, I think brand wise, it's always a bit of a shame to see something become part of a much bigger organization in a way. I suppose I have this weird thing of being like always kind of rooting for the underdog a bit.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I know I'm obviously kind of currently working on Google Fonts Knowledge, and it's not like Google's the underdog.
Yeah, but I'm in the same position.
But I do have this love of like little independent folks doing their own thing, and you know, and also, you know, I think Google Fonts also enjoy a degree of being away from the bigger Google organization. I mean, perhaps my colleagues who are Google employees might disagree, but I feel like Google Fonts gets, you know, there's a bunch of type nerds that get to sort of do their own thing. And obviously it has to tie into Google's wider thing, but we do get to just kind of noodle away on some really fantastic type-centric projects. And you can see that coming out through the way that they've, you know, really pushed variable fonts, really pushing color fonts now. All of this quite down the rabbit hole stuff that I think it's great that Google support those kind of things.
So how do you feel about this idea of free open source typefaces in general?
It's a really good question, a really fair question. And honestly, I have mixed feelings about it because I think the bad side of it, and the side that I suppose people perhaps focus on when they're being critical of Google Fonts, is that one, hey, you're giving away type for free, like you shouldn't do that. And two, you know, there might be some typefaces in the library that perhaps aren't as strong as, you know, a true sort of pro quote unquote font. And, you know, they can be fair criticisms. But on the plus side, there is the fact that actually there are some extremely great typefaces in there and very well crafted fonts that are being made available for free, which is amazing. People are actually getting to use free fonts of high quality, unlike, say, going to, you know, DeFont, as we all did in the early stages of our career, and got free fonts from there which were terrible. And again, that's not to say that everything on DeFont is terrible, but, you know, there's obviously the tendency for free fonts to be, or at least be seen as not as well made as professional ones. And I think the other thing with Google Fonts being able to make this stuff available for free is that they've done a lot of cool stuff with, especially like the Noto super family, of being able to make rare scripts available, you know, to use. You know, there are some communities that, you know, have never even had a digital font for their writing system, and to have those things available is really amazing. And yes, of course, the cynical side is, oh well, they're only there so Google can use them in their products and sell more products to us and this kind of thing. But, you know, I mean, I really feel like that's a fair price to pay. But, you know, they're doing a lot of work to really improve the library, to really put more really high quality fonts in there, and then just sort of generally upping the game. I guess there's always going to be that question of, you know, type is valuable. Type costs a lot of time and money and expertise to create, and people should be rewarded for that. You know, type designers shouldn't be expected to work for free. But, you know, Google do also support financially a lot of, you know, the stuff that's commissioned. And if you are a type designer yourself and you're choosing just to put something up there for free, you know, because obviously anyone can submit to the library, it is a very personal choice. You know, certainly no one's sort of making anyone put that stuff up there for free. And, you know, I will still always be up for telling people that it's great to pay for type, and it's great to make sure that type designers are paid fairly, or maybe their fonts are available for free but they're commissioned at a fair rate, and this kind of thing. The other argument around free font usage separate from type designers being compensated is obviously, if you are using a free font, does that then make your design less unique? Because in theory, many other people are going to be using those free fonts. And yeah, I think that's a totally valid argument. If you want to stand out radically. A good sort of shortcut to that is to pay for some fonts that aren't being, used everywhere. And if you really want to stand out, obviously you then pay a lot more to commission a bespoke typeface. Mm-hmm. But again, I think there's lots of work to be done in just trying to help people with good typography in general. So even if you're using one of the ubiquitous ones, even if you're just using Inter because Inter's the default in Figma, and Inter's great, it's wonderful. But, there is still things that can be done to that, to work with that. And I think that's really important. But yeah, I think it's great in general that more and more people are getting access to better type, and hopefully with Google Fonts Knowledge, access to information about just general sort of good typographic practice.
Yeah, no, you touched on that. Obviously, it's something I've been thinking a lot about is the pros of open source and the cons. I mean, how do you feel about money and creativity? And it doesn't not just type, but in all forms of design. What's your relationship with that? I always feel like creatives are almost just pleased to be doing what they're doing sometimes, and quite apologetic about having to send an invoice. It's like that's crazy. But how do you feel about that? Do you have a strategy? Are there certain projects you think, I really want this one? I'm not going to charge my normal rate,
Yeah, really good question. I think it comes down to I see like money as an enabler. So if I've never sought out a role, whether that's like, a sort of more full-time role like what I'm currently doing, or a freelance gig. I've never sought anything out for money. And obviously some are better paying than others. And, I get a decent amount of money contracting for Google, and I did for Adobe as well. Other ones are smaller because they're, a smaller agency, or it's more of a passion project. I've done some work recently, some music related stuff on the side, and some cover designs for Lute Slater's label Motor Volva. And we were kind of talking about how much to charge, knowing that they're a small label. I didn't want to charge them much money, and I was doing it because I wanted to work with them, and I wasn't doing it through any sort of financial motivation. Almost a passion project, and we were sort of talking about let's come to an agreement on what is gesture towards time spent kind of thing. And I think it just comes down to the project. So I think if it's something that you want to do because it's just the creative opportunity is there, or it's a way to connect with people, or to get your work in front of a different crowd, then obviously like the financial side of thing doesn't matter. But that said, obviously you couldn't apply that to every bit of work you do. You've got to pay the bills, and I'm in a very fortunate position where my sort of day job, as it were, is paying well enough for me to be able to take those kind of more sort of financial risks on the side. Yeah, but in terms of money in general, I think it's about that idea of money enabling your creativity, and the idea of the struggling artist, doesn't come from nowhere. If it's a pure pursuit of passion, then money doesn't come into it so much. But I think we're really lucky we're working in this industry, because I think what we do is kind of this sort of intersection. Like, it's not art. I don't want to elevate it to art, but it's not too far off, and yet we get to get sort of paid for it. And so because of that, generally working as a designer, I think we're quite lucky in that we get to be creative, but because it's in this commercial environment, we get to be compensated sort of decently, as opposed to sort of just being a sort of artist in the true sense, and kind of always struggling. And it's hard. I feel like as I've got older, had kids, and the responsibilities of mortgage and bigger bills, and obviously with the current financial climate, it is a bit scary. And I guess everyone is feeling that need to go, you know what, I'm going to lean a little bit more on the money mattering side of things than the creative fulfillment mattering, perhaps.
I can see you wrestling with this. Like, it's
I am.
And it's like, again, it's like money. It's only money. It's like, do you want it or not?
Yeah.
It's like, at the end of the day, you're providing a service. You shouldn't feel bad about that. You're delivering a very valuable asset to people that are making a lot of money out of their products. And you're more than entitled to charge money as well. But it's an uncomfortable subject for us as creators. I don't really know why that is.
It is.
Let's talk about the future of type. I mean, I think variable fonts, obviously huge. Google's made quite a big investment there. Monotype, we're I think pretty much everything we're doing now is variable as well. Every conversation now with a brand or a custom font is relating around variable as well. What's your kind of experience as a user of variable type? How do you feel about the user experience right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Really good question. Because I recently switched over. So my personal site uses Degular by Ono Typeco. And I recently switched over to the variable version of that. And I wrote a post about it. And I mentioned in that post that I'm what I would describe as a variable font realist. And then Micah and Olivia at the League of Movable Type, they really picked up on this on their podcast, and it made me laugh because they mentioned the fact that I'd said I'm this pragmatic user of a variable type, this variable type realist. And I am in that I don't, as a user of variable type, get super excited about moving an axis between, a weight value of 483 to 484.
What do you mean?
I mean, and there certainly are people who are into that level of granularity. And it does have its uses, because if we're talking about massive display type, then perhaps those things really start to come into their own. I think in practical use, it's more interesting to be able to sort of just slide and see the options available to you rather than sort of jump between sort of one integer on a scale like that. We did some stuff with this on Google Fonts Knowledge earlier in the year with parametric axes for Roboto Flex, the font bureau. We're collaborating with them on it. And the parametric axes are, on the one hand, super, super down the rabbit hole of like, there's variable axes, and then there's like really getting into like the minutiae of just changing the counter size and the thickness of the crossbar on uppercase H, this kind of thing. And on the one hand, it can be like, whoa, that is really down the rabbit hole. What's its practical uses? But actually, as I said, like for certain things, for creating logos, for instance, some of those things can really make the difference, and it avoids you having to actually sort of outline type and manipulate vectors in that way. And in other ways, things like being able to change, descender depth and ascender height so that you can maintain the same leading settings perhaps can be quite interesting to manipulate the type in a way that we previously haven't been able to. So I think there are some really interesting uses for it, for sure. And I'm a user of variable fonts. I'm currently working on a big project on the side. I haven't announced this yet, but basically I'm writing a book and I'm designing a book. And
nice.
I'm using the variable version of Degular to do that as well. So I'm currently kind of delving into some of the print-specific challenges of that. And they aren't massive, but it's more just setting up like certain paragraph styles and character styles, and InDesign going, oh yeah, if I change this axis here, then that's going to need to cascade over to that. And actually, in some ways, it's a lot easier to do on the web. But I think it's super interesting. Conversely, on the other side of things, I kind of hate choice in general. Like I don't like to be in a restaurant and have loads of things to choose from on the menu. Like give me 3 things to choose from and I'm much happier. And similarly, if I've got, say, 7 weights to play with, 9 weights to play with, 3 widths, that, I'm probably happy in most of those scenarios. And I do think there is that danger of giving people too much choice. And that world of variable fonts does open that up. But there are certainly circumstances where you need to have something just a little bit heavier or a little bit lighter, or perhaps a little bit wider, a little bit more condensed, where those variable axes can really help. I mean, actually, one example that I was talking to a friend about recently was the simple example of 2 lines of type. So say for a logo. So let's imagine 2 words set on top of each other, and they're 2 words that are different lengths. There are many different ways that you can kind of make them fit. It might be that you change the weight of them to make one much heavier to sort of take up the same sort of horizontal space. It might be, the font size. It might be many, many different parameters. But one, just considering sort of width, with variable fonts, being able to be quite granular with the width so that they could actually line up and be sort of perfectly in line. And I'm thinking of things like perhaps logos, simple logos, or perhaps, even social media graphics and these kind of things where people might want to sort of create a sort of type-based image and to have, let's say 5 lines of type, 1 word a line, just kind of have them effectively fully justified. That kind of thing is possible by manipulating the width parameter. and that's cool. But it's all the other things, well, the stuff like being able to manipulate grade ever so slightly for when you've got one page in your magazine that's white type on a black background instead of the other way around, and when it's reversed out, there are some considerations with the way that ink's going to behave there, so maybe switching to an ever such slightly heavier grade is going to help out with stuff like that. And I think those kind of things are really interesting, and the opportunities to tell people about that and show examples. And this is what I'm really into with what we're doing at Google Fonts Knowledge, is to talk about some of these. They're not like niche use cases or anything like that, but they're just not necessarily talked about that widely. It's nice to kind of be able to bring some of these considerations to a wider audience, to folks who might not have considered that you might want to change things like that. And certainly variable fonts have the power there to really just kind of finesse that type that little bit.
Yeah, I think for me, like, as you mentioned, like, it's not that finessing, it's not that moving it one unit along the weight axes that gets me excited. What I'm really excited about is the engagement aspect of it. So the interaction bit, like we did that variable logo font with Amsterdoc a few years ago now, where you could dance in front of a camera and change the axes of the design.
Oh, yeah.
And then, with the Every project we launched earlier this year.
Yes.
It was like so many versions of the same letter, and actually we had to work with Microsoft and Adobe just to get that project to work. We rewrote some of the spec just to get the support, and even with the Glyphs app guys, they rewrote the app so that we could build it, because we were punching out a
really
font. It was 25 megabytes, the original font file. And we managed to rewrite the whole thing and get it down to standard size, thank God.
Wow.
Yeah, it was huge. But I mean, again, it's like that interaction, that new generative form of identity and brand design, which I think is really interesting. I think a lot of brand agencies are exploring. And then when you think about the metaverse and AR, VR, all of that stuff, how's type going to start shape shifting, getting into the metaverse? Imagine you're walking around a book rather than reading it on paper, and you're interacting with letters. I'm really interested in what we can do in that space.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you've kind of mentioned this already, but where do you sit on the kind of small foundries versus big foundries? You see social media, the political landscape of typography. I think my colleague Marie called it type Twitter the other week. Oh, yeah. But there's so much of, type Twitter. What do you think of all that? I kind of think it's a bit silly, but... I
mean, yeah, as you say, I mentioned earlier, the kind of always this idea of rooting for the little guy kind of thing, for the underdog. Yeah. I worked at Adobe and, working with Google at the moment, and speaking on the Monotype podcast. Yeah. So I'm totally fine with exactly. So yeah, I mean, I'm totally fine with the big companies, and I think the huge companies have these resources to enable us to invest in these kind of awesome little geeky projects, and I think that's fantastic. But like I said, I love independent foundries just for some deep-seated rooting for the underdog kind of thing that's in me. And I'm always encouraging, whenever I sort of teach a typography workshop, I do encourage folks to explore independent foundries for two reasons. One, I think it's important for those folks to be represented, and it can be harder to be lost in the sea of all of the foundries that are out there and to compete with the big folks. I also see supporting independent foundries from a user's perspective as a shortcut to doing something a bit more unique. Simply by choosing a font that not everyone knows about, you're probably going to be able to stand out a little bit. And so there is that appeal, I think, that independent foundries have as well. We'll check this afterwards, but I think it's type.lol is a resource that's basically a big old list of indie foundries that I really love and I always send people to. I want to shout out to this thing that I discovered a couple of days ago, Matthias Ott, whose website is Matthias with two T's, ott.com, and he is currently doing an independent type foundry advent calendar.
Wow.
And every day is just doing a quick post about an indie type foundry, posting some of their imagery,
that's great.
Some specimens and whatnot. Yeah. And it's a really nice way of exposing folks to foundries who might otherwise not be in the sort of public consciousness.
That's brilliant.
The advantage that indie foundries might have over a larger foundry or sort of conglomerate is that collaboration with the type designers for smaller folks might be a little bit easier, in the sense of, I don't have loads of money. In fact, hey, I've got no money, but could I speak to you about using a beta version of your typeface? Is probably going to go over a little bit easier with a sort of one person shop than it is with a giant company. But and I think like almost everything we've discussed here, there's the two sides of the story and everything in between. The free fonts and the paid for fonts each offer their own advantages and disadvantages, and the same with the tiny foundries versus the big conglomerates. For some situations, one is more suitable for the other, you know?
Yeah, I think something I've really focused on at Monotype since joining sort of 3 years ago now is just trying to build that direct designer to designer kind of contact and breaking down that idea a little bit. That we are a big company, but we're still designers, and almost the studio is quite a small part really of what the business does. So I really wanted to make us more approachable, I guess, like build those relationships. And I think there's this misconception that Monotype is competing with other type foundries. And actually, we're not really competing. We just provide a creative service like in the same way that you do, everybody does. And actually, we're not a big design team. And actually, most of the work we do is actually outsourced. You know, I'm working with freelance type designers, other foundries all over the world on many projects.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And like we are all kind of in it together. Like everyone is friends. Like even when you have the big companies supposedly like competing against each other, and you know the lawyers from each one's kind of like agonizing over whether they're going to collaborate. Like ultimately the people doing the work are all just kind of a bunch of type geeks.
Yeah.
Everyone gets on, you know, everyone's kind of just wanting to do the same thing. So yeah, it's nice.
So Elliot, can type save the world? I'm going to throw that at you.
I think type has already saved the world.
And do you have any kind of last sort of message to our listeners? What can we look forward to, I guess, next year from Google Fonts Knowledge?
From Google Fonts Knowledge, you can expect some more content next year. And the content we've just released, I think, does a really nice job of sort of rounding out a lot of it. Like we've got some really great articles that have just launched and a whole big introduction to CJK. We're definitely doing way more sort of non-Latin, although that's a bit of a contentious term, of course, but more non-Latin content next year, which is going to be really great. And yeah, I'm super excited about all of the new stuff that's coming out. And I also wanted to say thanks for having me on here. I've got just above me here, I've got the Creative Characters book, which is the one put together by My Fonts. This is pre My Fonts being part of Monotype, I think.
Yes.
And it was all of Jan Middendorp's email newsletters that he did, where he interviewed a bunch of type designers over, I guess, years, and it's compiled into this lovely book. And if I remember rightly, that was kind of a big source of inspiration for when I was starting out doing 8 Faces. So it's lovely to kind of see that come full circle. And I love that Creative Characters is still out there in the world as a podcast.
Brilliant. Elliot, thanks so much for joining the Creative Characters podcast today. It's been lovely to have you on the show, and hopefully we can meet in person sometime very soon. I'll have to pop over that way.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really great chatting. Then yeah, you should do that, Phil. That'd be really nice.
Brilliant. See you soon, man.
See you soon. Take care.
Thanks for listening. Elliot has a lot going on, so you can check out everything he's working on in one place at elliotjstocks.com. As always, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. If you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype, Angelino Audio, and Marie DeBarez, with special help from Mia Sullivan. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.